It hardly seems possible that the last time I was standing here was just 2 weeks ago. And it was the morning after Swami Kriyananda, the founder of Ananda, and for many of us, our spiritual guide and mentor, left his body, not, you can't say unexpectedly when a man is 86 and has been at the edge of death multiple times, but without warning, let's put it that way. Just before breakfast, just became time instead to go into the infinite. David and I left immediately Monday morning for Europe. He left his body in Assisi, Italy, where there was a great gathering of the tribe, and his body was put out in state in the temple there, and there were many services and so on. I'm sure many of you have been following it online, and if you haven't, you can easily, and it's definitely worth going and hearing some of the things that happened. Everything that happened in Italy was done in Italian and in English, so it's a little slow moving, but it's all there. I lost connection completely with everything. As you can well imagine, as I put it to David, I've never been a grown-up without Swami Kriyananda in my life. My parents raised me into my 20s, but then I became a person after I met Swamiji and learned about the spiritual path. I've spoken about him already many times, and I have always spoken about him, even when he was still living with us, so that won't be new, but I'm not going to give another memorial service. But nonetheless, everything I'm going to say is informed by these events, because there's no greater reality in my life right at the moment. I can't do anything else but this. As I wrote, and many of you received a letter from me, for the first so many days after Swamiji's sudden passing, I felt extremely even-minded in a sense. Partly it's because when duty calls, one of my characteristics is that I'm very calm in other people's crises. And so having this being everybody's crisis, I was able to just do what I needed to do in a natural way. It wasn't until we got all the way to Assisi, Italy, even seeing his empty body there. I've been with people who have died before, and I've never been squeamish about death. So seeing a corpse, even the corpse of someone you love so much, well, there it is. It's clearly not him. It just looks like what he used to look like. But it wasn't until I went to his house, which is where we've always seen him in Assisi. And we went into the little room, his bedroom where he passed away, which for many people was a very elevated experience, and it was not for me. That was the moment when the human side just kicked in, and for a number of hours I was pretty worthless. It was now my crisis, and I'm not so calm in my crisis, right? Just, we all live on many levels. But of course, I couldn't stay there. I've always been impressed by the story of when Yogananda passed away, and he also, Swami, it's odd how the mind works. Paramhansa Yogananda died just at the end of giving a speech at a dinner party at the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles. I mean, he was just standing at the podium, then he finished his poem, and then he stopped his heart. His heart stopped beating, and he fell over. And it was unexpected and quite dramatic, no long goodbyes or anything like that. And I don't know why I didn't realize that Swami Kriyananda would do something very similar in every other way. He emulates his guru. Not so public, but also without preamble. And I was listening on Friday night. His body stayed in Assisi for about a week, and then they sealed up the coffin. Many years ago, somebody at Ananda had the intelligence to you can get insurance for everything, to get insurance for the repatriation of a corpse. So they had this big insurance policy to bring Swami back from wherever he was in the world and to bring 2 people back with him, thank God, because it would be very expensive. So his body was brought back to Ananda village, where it is now, in the sealed coffin now. See, the coffin was open. It had to be sealed to be transported, because that's where Swamiji said he wanted his body buried. It will not be cremated, because you do not cremate the bodies of highly advanced spiritual people, because the bodies still hold divine power. And so they're going to build what we're calling a moksha mandir. Moksha means divine liberation. And like they do in India, we'll bury his body in the ground and build a small temple over it, so it can be a place of meditation forever. Apparently in Nevada County, if you own enough land, you can bury a few of your loved ones on it. And intelligently, all of this has been worked out for a long time, so it's all in motion. So they were starting the whole process over in Ananda village of what we'd just been through for a week in Assisi. And Anand and Kirtani, who are the leaders in Italy, happen to be American, but they live in Italy, were the ones who came across with the body. So Kirtani and Anand happened to be two of the only 8 people who were present when Swami actually breathed his last. So Kirtani on Friday night at the service at the village, which you can see online, was talking, this time in English nicely, about Swami's last moments. And I'd heard parts of it before, but there was something that struck me this time that I really hadn't captured. Swamiji had a moment when they were all watching him in which this intense wave of energy seemed to go all the way up from his feet, all the way through his whole body, and his whole body responded to it with a great deal of force like this, and then he just became completely relaxed again, at which point he no longer had a heartbeat. And it's not hard to imagine that that's the point at which he, by his own will, stopped his heart and left his body. His nurse and his attendant, Narayani, were still concerned, and they were trying to get him to breathe and saying Om in his right ear, and they moved him from the table where he was sitting and stretched him out on the bed. And he actually took a couple of more breaths, but I never heard anyone say that there was ever a pulse after that. Kirtani and Anand arrived a few minutes into this by the time he was stretched out on the bed. And the way Kirtani described it, there was a certain amount of effort on the part of his nurse and a few others to see if this was really it. When Master died, it's interesting also, at the Biltmore Hotel, the disciples were also there chanting Om in his right ear. In his particular life, he'd sometimes go into a state of cosmic consciousness and appear to have left his body. The word samadhi, which means cosmic consciousness, is something that a great master experiences often. Maha samadhi, the great samadhi, is the one in which they don't come back. So the disciples didn't know which samadhi he was in, and by chanting Om in his right ear, perhaps would bring him back to consciousness. And the same procedure was followed just to see. And Swami took a couple of more breaths over the course of just a couple of minutes there, but the pulse never started, and he really was already gone. Kirtani and Anand arrived while he was still breathing every once in a while. And Kirtani, being herself an extraordinary evolved person, didn't get drawn into any of the effort, but just sat. And once the drama was past and they realized that he was not returning, as she put it, she tried to experience what he was experiencing. And I heard her say this before, but I didn't understand it until she said it on Friday night. And what she described, she said, was a state of absolute stillness, such as she never even could have imagined before. And she described it sequentially. You see, we're always living inside our heartbeat, aren't we? Whatever else is going on, our heart is going thump, thump, thump like that. And as a result of the heart beating, we're inhaling and we're exhaling. So even when we're sitting still doing nothing, there's this whole universe of activity going on inside of us. And our little cells are doing their little jobs, and the blood is rushing all over the place. And one of the affirmations for good health that Yogananda has in his Healing Affirmations books has you picture all your little intelligent cells and their happy little mouths consuming life force and making you well again. One of my friends, Paula, who eventually died of cancer after several bouts, she used to particularly like that one. She had a whimsical nature, and she used to love the little picture of all her little individual cells with their individual little mouths sort of consuming life force, and that was how she imagined herself getting better. So even when we're apparently doing nothing, all those little cells with their little mouths are consuming life force, and the heart is pounding, and the blood is flowing, and the brain waves are active. There's always some movement, isn't there? Now, when we meditate, often the breath becomes very minimal, the heart rate can slow down. When we're very, very calm, all the little cells are still eating their life force. But nonetheless, we can bring all of that into a greater and greater absence of motion. And great yogis go into a state of samadhi, and they can actually stop the heart and they can stop the breath. That's why when Master fell over in the Biltmore, and that's even when Swami's heart and breath stopped, it was not necessarily a sign of death. It could also be a sign of the yogic trance. Trance is the word that people use, meaning altered state. In fact, when Yogananda first came to America and was giving these very big lectures in all the big cities in America, he used to do a lot of demonstrations of the extraordinary power he had. This was the 1920s. He hadn't written Autobiography of a Yogi. He didn't write it till 1946. And he was the first Indian master to really live in this country. Vivekananda had been here for a few years before, but Vivekananda didn't campaign across the country and draw the public in the way that Yogananda did. And he needed some dramatic ways to make it clear to people that he was someone other than they had seen before. So he would stop his heartbeat, he would stop his breath, he would do extraordinary demonstrations of physical control and physical power and strength, as well as healings. He would have doctors come up and they would take his pulse, and he would have a different pulse in each wrist. Or he would stop the pulse on one side and keep the pulse going on the other, just showing a complete mastery over his physical body. Now, Swami Kriyananda never did that kind of thing, but he often told us stories of medical procedures and dental procedures, of extraordinary mastery over his physical body from the average person. So there was different dharmas, you say, different purposes in what they did. Well, let me come back to where I was. So Kirtani is there in this relatively small bedroom where Swami lives in Assisi. That whole house is very small. He built that house for solitude. And she's aware of the fact that Swami's heart is no longer beating, and there's no breath flowing. And then that means that the brain is not functioning and there's no thoughts within him. And then she just became conscious, as I was starting to stay, of this absolute stillness. She said that she'd never touched ever or even imagined in her life before. Now, when we think in terms of enlightenment or liberation, I was actually thinking of our school plays. And this has been a source of controversy among the various artistic directors of the school plays, because our school plays are often about great souls and often they attain enlightenment. And whether or not a disco ball whirling around in the middle of the auditorium is actually a true representation of what enlightenment is. And there has been a tendency to create a whole lot of noise and a whole lot of stuff trying to indicate that cosmic consciousness has now been reached. Well, from the point of view of doing a play with children for their grandparents and their uncles and aunts, it would be pretty hard to bring the entire production to a halt and have anyone perceive that anything had happened. So we have lived with the interpretation that's been offered. But you see, the fact of it is exactly the opposite. The fact of it is, the farther out we are from center, the more the duality is really, really moving. That's why people who live far from their centers, they drink and they party and they get really, really, really loud, and then they get really, really tired, and then they get up again, and then they drink and they get loud, and then they get really tired, and they dance. You know, really, it's just like the farther you are from your center, the more chaos is created there, because everything emanates from this point of stillness, and the bigger the arc, the greater the force, just like a metronome. The closer you come to your point of center, you see everything ceases. This is how Swamiji put it once too. It gets simpler and simpler and simpler, until you reach that point, you see, where there is no movement at all, not even in your own physical body. Now, 2 weeks ago, when I was speaking just hours after we had word that Swamiji had passed. And I was talking about, his physical body, and I said at that time that I keep pictures of Swamiji and Master where I can see them when I wake up in the morning, so as soon as I am conscious enough to remember who I am and where I am, I can also remember why I'm here. And I often speak to them. And so the morning, Sunday morning 2 weeks ago, good morning, Swamiji. And then I thought, everything's the same for me, but different for you now. But then I thought to myself, how different really, I wonder. Everything looks different to me, but I wonder how really different it looks to him. Now, in all these 2 weeks of travel, and I had to go to Los Angeles after we came back from Italy for some things to do with the Ananda movie, because it's just these things seem to be all snarled up together. So it was many, many days before I really had calmness, and in many ways it was really just yesterday morning when we had the long meditation in honor of the Kriya initiation, when I could really, finally, just sit. And on the Friday night before, I had this picture in my mind of Kirtani talking about the heart stopping, the breath stopping, the brain stopping, and all thoughts on that level being over. And for the first time, I could feel it from his point of view. Now, imagine, I was also remembering when Swamiji was a young monk living with Yogananda. And he said to us sometimes, he said, we think that it would be better if we had known Master in the body and could have lived with him. And he said, Swamiji says, of course, it was a thrilling experience. But in certain ways, he said, it's easier for you to understand him because you never saw him walking around in a physical body. Swamiji said as a young disciple, and bear in mind there was no context for this at all, this is 1948, 1949, that he knew that Master was infinite in his awareness, but as Swamiji said, he was in the room next door having dinner. How could he be in the room next door having dinner and also be infinite in his awareness? And he said sometimes his mind would spin. And once he was sitting in the room with Master and just watching him and then just trying so hard to try to feel what his consciousness was. And when Master feeling what Swamiji was trying to intuit, Master looked at him. He responded to Swamiji's efforts in several different ways, but this was the time. He looked Swamiji right into the eye, and he just said it like this, if you knew my consciousness. Meaning you're trying so hard with your mind, there's just no way that you could really comprehend, what my consciousness really is. So the masters tell this over and over again. So I was trying to imagine if one is identified and lives in the whole ocean. And again, in our own minds, we always think in physical terms. And we try to stretch from one end of the ocean to the other end of the ocean. And it seems so far away and so big to us, doesn't it? One of the incomprehensible truisms that Swamiji has offered many times, every time he says it, I listen intently and think, maybe this time I'll understand it. And it's when he says to us that the farthest star is as close to us as our own hand. That space itself is one of those illusions of this plane of consciousness, that everything exists in consciousness, and if it's only consciousness, you are simultaneously everywhere. And this whole thought of time and space is just part of this level of reality. Now, I'm a little closer to it, but I'm definitely not there. So if you're a little confused by that, we're all in it together on this one. But I was trying to feel that in terms of being the whole ocean. And not just this way, this inevitable way, you see, this is the end of my fingertips, and then there's the ocean. It's interesting because, as I was explaining 2 weeks ago, my experience of Swami Kriyananda from the first moment I laid eyes on him walking into a room has always been exactly the same. And what it has been defined is consciousness without edges. without borders, without a point at which it ceases. We may have an aura that's a little bigger than our body, magnetism maybe that reaches out, but there's this deeply held subconscious thought of edges, isn't it? Maybe we can move out a little bit. And it's true, because the ego, the sense of individuality is identified with this whole swirling mass of samskars, of vrittis, of karmic, of self-identification. And even if it's a little bigger, it still has an edge point. Well, I was trying to project in a visualization what I have always experienced of Swamiji. What would it mean to have no edges, to be the entire ocean of consciousness, and then up from those depths, there are the waves. We've all seen these artistic renderings, these simple renderings of an ocean, and then you see the waves. They have that little curl to them, don't they? And this is an image that the masters often use to try to help us understand who we are. We are just waves on the great infinite ocean. We are the movement of energy. And so we rise and we fall, and we rise and we fall. And what happens to us is we become identified with our particular little wave, don't we? Just what I was saying. We try to push it up. We get distressed when it comes down. We notice that we're a little bit shorter than the others, and we try to rise again. We get great big, and we're really proud of ourselves, having no idea that the fall is inevitable. Because the waves never, as Master puts it, the level of the ocean never fundamentally changes. The sea is not affected by the waves. So I thought of Swamiji with a consciousness as big as the sea, but nonetheless, he's been responsible for this one particular wave, hasn't he? I mean, the body which you've seen pictures of him laid out. Last week, I know they had a photograph of David and I standing in front of the empty body now. And I've had very little death touch my life, but I appreciate that there's something of value to solidly seeing the body without the spirit in it. It definitely tells you that a change has taken place. But he's been moving that body all this time. And he's been keeping the heart beating. And he's been doing the breath, and all the little cells were eating the life force. And he had a sparkling intellect, and a brilliant mind, and creativity, and music, and all these different things has all been projected through that wave. But from the perspective of the ocean. Now, our suffering, all of it, is because we live in our wave from the perspective of the wave. And so what happens to that wave is really a big deal to us, because it's most of our field of vision, isn't it? It's most of our field of feeling. It's most of our field of thought. I remember when I was 18 years old and I read in a spiritual book, "Don't think about yourself and you'll be happy." And I thought to myself, what else is there to think about? It was such a novel thought. I wasn't selfish exactly, but I was always, how shall I put it, calculating my own position. And usually not even in a negative way, but I was always aware of how much fun I was having and whether or not I could have a little more by calculating what was going on around me. The thought of not rotating my attention entirely on my individual wave was just revolutionary. Truly revolutionary. And from that moment, that was where my sadhana started. Not all that successfully at the beginning, but at least I knew where I was going with it. Well, this is the paradox that is so difficult for us to comprehend when we're looking at a great master. Here Swamiji is sitting in the company of Yogananda, of Master when he was alive, and he's looking at the wave, and he's trying to sort of spread the wave out to make it big enough to be Yogananda. And Master sort of felt sorry for him because it's going at it completely from the wrong end. It's not that the wave gets bigger and bigger. In fact, interestingly, Master said the definition of a master, we would think the definition of the master would be the tsunami of all waves, wouldn't it? it would be the 800-footer that just comes and sweeps over the continent. But in fact, Master says the more advanced you are spiritually, the closer you are to the surface of the ocean, the less wave there is. Just as I was saying, the farther away you are, the more happens. The closer you are, the less happens. But nonetheless, you keep the heart beating, you keep it breathing, you keep it making sparkling conversation. It laughs appropriately, it tells jokes, it gets hungry and it eats. But all from the point of view of the ocean. And when I really began to feel, and I think began is the tiniest word, because to say that I was there would be, well, I won't go up farther than that, but I began to feel that Swami just simply stopped the heartbeat. That so little for him changed, you see? And that's why Master could just give that poem about India at that last dinner in honor of the Indian consulate and say the last word and then just stop his heartbeat. Because you see, so little had changed. Now, the main change that the masters feel and know is how it looks from our point of view. And Miriam, who is has been Swamiji's nurse now for 15 years or so, made the comment that she felt that Swami left when that wave of energy went through him because there was no heartbeat after that. But because she, and because the woman who's been taking care of him for a long time, Narayani, also, they were unprepared. She said he tried to come back. And he actually breathed a couple of times, and even Narayani was right close to him. He opened his eyes just a little bit and looked at her, and then he breathed out and closed his eyes, and that was it. Because, Miriam said, he made an effort for their sakes. And Kirtani and Anand were just standing back. There was no requirement to make an effort for their sakes. And everybody was playing their part just as they ought to. This was not like, Narayani was just, as she said to Swami, right in the moment, it's too soon. But of course later she realized, how could it be too soon? What she was saying is, I think it's too soon. I was not expecting this. But from the point of view of the advanced soul, they just stopped the heartbeat. And I began to think, what a glorious way to look at death for all of us. That we are this whole ocean, whether the difference between the master and the highly advanced soul and the rest of us, this is very important to understand. They are not more the ocean than we are, and we are not less the ocean than they are. Think about it. Is any wave actually separate from the ocean? I mean, is there any one wave that you can actually draw a circle about and kind of lift it off the ocean and just keep it over here like a little pet goldfish or something like that? Right. Is there any wave that is made of anything but the substance of the ocean, of the force of the ocean? Is there any wave that doesn't result from the entire movement of the entire ocean? So the only difference between us and the great masters is our lack of awareness. That's all. Nothing in our reality. That's why it's called realization. We realize the reality of what we are. We don't become something. We just cease being confused about what we actually are. And yes, from the point of view of the waves, and I've been the first to say this, wow, Swami Kriyananda not being in the body anymore, not coming to visit, not writing any emails, it was so goofy. There I was, there we were in Italy. Every day we're seeing the body laid out in the casket, being buried in rose petals, and all these different services, and hundreds of people. It was just an extraordinary gathering. And then I wake up in the morning, and David's looking at his emails, and I almost say, is there anything from Swami? And then I realize, oh, I guess there won't be anything more from Swami, at least not through that email, not through that internet, not through that World Wide Web. It's a different one that he'll communicate in. So I'm the first to say, this is a change. When somebody's heart stops beating and that body stops working, then a certain habitual accessibility is taken away from us. But standing back, both into their consciousness and into our own, you see, nothing has really changed. Just all that agitation at the surface has now been calmed, and the power that's there has just sunk ever more deeply into the depths. Now there's one last little thought I want to offer in this before I leave this analogy, and I'll carry it on because I think it's important. I've talked to you at different times about things that I struggle with, that I think all of us struggle with. Emotional responses, reactive process, irrational feelings about various things, anxieties, fears, annoyances, sense of mistreatment, all of these different things. And I, in the course of these last couple of weeks, was sort of running through a few of those myself and just trying to clear the decks for a greater reality. As someone said on Facebook, all our jobs just got bigger, so we all need to sort of work for that. And I was realizing that quite apart from anything I can remember in this life, of which there's been very little, all of us carry these, samskars is the word for them, deep karmic impressions from all the lifetimes that we had. A psychic person told me, truly or false, I don't know, but I was talking about a certain anxiety I felt for a short period of time when David and I would travel, whenever he would leave me alone in the airport just to go do something and then come back to the gate. There was a period of a few months or even a year or two where his absence would put me into a panic, totally unreasonable. I mean, he's not going to miss the plane. What am I concerned about? But this chaos would come up. And this psychic woman who heard me say that said, she told me this whole story about being 9 years old and my mother died and my father couldn't handle me, couldn't raise me alone, so he took me on a train several cities away and abandoned me in a train station. And there I am, a little girl, you know, and where's my daddy? And then I had to make a life after that. It's apocryphal if not accurate. Doesn't matter if it's actually true, it matches a certain resonance in me. Oddly, as soon as she said that to me, this thought came to me instantly. That was both an extremely important positive life for me, from what I had to do to survive, and I got some really bad habits from that, twofold. So I was contemplating that, all in the same thought of the wave in the ocean, thinking of all of that and saying to God, I am so sick of this stuff. You know, how long ago did my father leave me in a train station? I mean, like, how long do I have to keep thinking about this? And suddenly the most obvious answer came. Well, if we're identified with the wave, if we've decided, all of that emotion, those are vrittis, those are whirlpools of energy committed in the spine that are moving around like this, around this, I was abandoned, people don't love me, why don't they listen to me, and just whatever it is, I'm so much better and they just don't like my ideas, and why are they, I used to have this funny thing from being an absolute monarch, when we would have meetings, and I would express my opinion and people would keep discussing the issue. It would be the slight puzzlement. Why are they still talking about it? You know, that movement of energy that just goes around, this is who I am, this is who I am, why don't people respond to me? Or why don't they apologize? Why don't they take care of me? How could they abandon me? Just on and on and on, movement, 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 movement. The absolute opposite of the complete oneness of spirit, isn't it? We're separated and we're suffering. And we try to solve all that, and I try to solve all that by willpower and forgiveness and, discipline and surrender and all these different things. But here's the easiest way to do it. Step back from the wave. Just go to the bottom of the ocean. And how important does that wave seem at this point? And how much of my reality is it, after all? A great yogi just slips out of his body just before breakfast. Or standing at the podium at a beautiful dinner, he finishes his poem, he stops his heartbeat, and he just walks away because nothing has changed. And what a lesson for all of that, us, isn't it? And not just a lesson in death, but a profound and practical perhaps the most practical possible lesson for life. Why wait? Why hold on to the last second and be ripped away? Why not just live in that ocean so that when the time comes to stop the heartbeat and lose the breath and let all the thoughts go, it's no change for us. From joy I came, for joy I live, in sacred joy I melt again.